The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered porch of the Sweetwater Trading Post as Abigail Norwood clutched the telegram that would forever change her life. Her trembling fingers traced the words announcing her brother's death, leaving her alone in the world with nothing but a deed to land she'd never seen in a town she'd never heard of. Colorado Territory, 1878, a place where a woman alone had few prospects and even fewer protections. Abigail folded the telegram neatly, tucking it into her skirt pocket. At 22, she had already endured more than her fair share of hardship, but this new reality threatened to overwhelm her completely. The stagecoach to Redemption Valley would leave at dawn, and with it, all hope for a future she'd never imagined. "Miss," the postmaster called after her as she turned to leave. "Them parts ain't kind to a woman traveling alone. You got family waiting for you." "No," Abigail replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "But I have little choice in the matter." The journey west stretched before her like an endless ribbon of uncertainty, each mile carrying her further from the life she'd known in Boston. The cramped stagecoach rattled and swayed, filled with an assortment of travelers, a salesman with slick-backed hair and two white teeth, a middle-aged couple returning home from visiting their daughter, and a quiet man in the corner whose eyes never seemed to settle in one place. 5 days of dust and discomfort later, the stagecoach rolled into Redemption Valley just as the sun was setting, painting the distant mountains in hues of gold and purple. The small town appeared before them like a mirage, a single main street lined with wooden buildings, their facades announcing various businesses: Johnson's General Store, the Silver Dollar Saloon, and at the far end, a white-clapboard church with a modest steeple reaching toward the heavens. "End of the line, folks," the driver announced, helping Abigail down with a calloused hand. "Welcome to Redemption Valley." Abigail stood alone in the street, her carpetbag at her feet, wondering where to begin. According to the deed, her brother's property lay just beyond the town limits, a small ranch he'd purchased 6 months before his death. But night was falling, and she needed somewhere to stay. The town's only hotel stood across from the stagecoach stop, its windows glowing with lamplight. As Abigail crossed the dusty street, she became acutely aware of eyes watching her, curious gazes from the saloon porch, from shopkeepers closing up for the night, from women gathering their children for supper. A newcomer was always a curiosity in such a small town, but a young, unaccompanied woman was something else entirely. The hotel proprietor, Mrs. Finch, was a stern-faced woman with kind eyes who took one look at Abigail and her single carpetbag and seemed to understand immediately. "You'll be Thomas Norwood's sister, then," she said matter-of-factly. "We'd heard you might be coming." Abigail blinked in surprise. "Yes, but how did you—" "News travels fast in Redemption Valley, Miss Norwood. Your brother was well liked here. His passing was a terrible thing." Mrs. Finch's expression softened. "I've got a room for you. Not fancy, but clean, and I'll have some supper sent up." That night, Abigail sat by the window of her small room, watching as the town settled into darkness. In the distance, she could make out the silhouette of the church steeple against the star-filled sky. Her brother had died without ever sending for her, without telling her about this place or why he'd chosen it. Tomorrow, she would have to make her way to his property to see what little legacy he'd left behind. Morning came with the sounds of a town waking, wagon wheels on dirt roads, merchants opening their shops, the distant lowing of cattle. Abigail dressed in her plain gray traveling dress, pinning her chestnut hair into a tight bun at the nape of her neck. She needed to present herself as respectable, capable, not someone to be pitied or preyed upon. After a simple breakfast of eggs and biscuits, she approached Mrs. Finch about transportation to her brother's ranch. "You'll want to speak with Sheriff Miller first," Mrs. Finch advised. "There's some matters concerning your brother's property that need sorting." The sheriff's office was 3 doors down from the hotel, a modest building with a small jail attached to the back. Inside, Sheriff Miller was a mountain of a man with a salt and pepper beard and eyes that had seen too much violence. "Miss Norwood," he greeted her, standing when she entered. "Been expecting you. Please, have a seat." Abigail sat stiffly, hands folded in her lap. "Mrs. Finch said there were matters to discuss regarding my brother's property." Sheriff Miller nodded, his expression grave. Your brother's death wasn't as straightforward as the telegram might have indicated. A cold knot formed in Abigail's stomach. What do you mean? Thomas was shot, Miss Norwood. We found him on his property with a bullet in his back. The sheriff's voice was gentle but direct. We've been investigating, but so far, we have no suspects. Abigail felt the room spin slightly, her vision narrowing. Murder. Her brother had been murdered. The ranch is yours by right, Sheriff Miller continued. But there's been some interest in the property since your brother's death. It seems the land is more valuable than Thomas might have realized when he purchased it. Valuable in what way? Abigail asked, finding her voice again. There's talk of the railroad coming through, and your brother's land sits right along the most likely route. He paused, studying her reaction. You might find yourself receiving offers. I'd advise caution before accepting any of them. As Abigail left the sheriff's office, her mind reeling with this new information, she nearly collided with a tall figure on the boardwalk. Strong hands steadied her, and she looked up into the most piercing blue eyes she'd ever seen. Careful there, madam, the man said, his voice deep and resonant. He was dressed like most men in these parts, worn denim trousers, a simple shirt with a leather vest, and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his face from the morning sun. But there was something different about him, a quietness, a watchfulness that set him apart. I'm sorry, Abigail murmured, stepping back. I wasn't looking where I was going. The man tipped his hat slightly. No harm done. You must be Thomas Norwood's sister. Abigail was growing tired of being known by everyone when she knew no one. Yes, I am. And you are? Ethan Thornton. I was a friend of your brother's. His expression was unreadable. I'm sorry for your loss. Before Abigail could respond, a shout from down the street drew their attention. A man on horseback was approaching at a gallop, pulling up sharply in front of the sheriff's office. Trouble at the Wilson place, the rider announced to the gathering crowd. Cattle rustlers hit last night. 2 hands shot. Sheriff Miller emerged from his office, buckling on his gun belt. Thornton, he called. I could use your help. Ethan Thornton nodded once, then turned back to Abigail. Miss Norwood, I'd be obliged if we could continue this conversation later. Perhaps I could call on you tomorrow? There are things about your brother you should know. With that cryptic statement, he strode toward the livery stable, leaving Abigail with more questions than answers. That afternoon, the town clerk arranged for Abigail to be driven out to her brother's property. The driver, an elderly man named Josiah, seemed to know every rock and tree in the territory, filling the journey with stories about the land and its people. Your brother picked a fine piece of property, Josiah said as they crested a hill. Good water, good grazing land. He had plans, Thomas did. Below them lay a modest ranch house with a barn and corral. A small creek wound through the property, bordered by cottonwood trees. It wasn't grand, but it was more than Abigail had expected. What happened to my brother's livestock? She asked, noticing the empty corrals. Sold off after he died. Sheriff's been holding the money for you. Josiah clicked to the horses, urging them down the slope. The house should be in decent shape. Thomas had a hand helping him, fellow named Miguel. He's been keeping an eye on things. The ranch house was simple but solid, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a small sitting area. Everything was neat but covered in a fine layer of dust. On the kitchen table sat a framed photograph of Thomas and Abigail taken years ago, before he'd headed west. I'll wait outside while you look around, Josiah offered. Take your time. Abigail moved through the room slowly, touching the furniture, opening drawers, trying to feel some connection to the brother she'd lost. In his bedroom, she found a small desk with a leather-bound journal. She opened it hesitantly, feeling like an intruder in her brother's private thoughts, but knowing it might hold answers. The journal's entries detailed Thomas's life in Redemption Valley, his purchase of the ranch, his plans for cattle breeding, his friendship with Ethan Thornton, who had apparently helped him build the barn. The final entry was dated just 3 days before his death. E.T. brought news today that confirms my suspicions. VB has been buying up properties all along the proposed railroad route. My refusal to sell has made me enemies, but I cannot in good conscience sell knowing what I know. If anything happens to me, the deed and the evidence are with Reverend Hayes at the church. Abigail will need to know the truth. Abigail closed the journal, her heart pounding. What evidence? What truth? And who was VB? A knock at the door startled her. Josiah stood in the doorway, his weathered face apologetic. "Miss Norwood, we should be heading back soon if we want to reach town before dark." Reluctantly, Abigail gathered her brother's journal and a few personal items, promising herself she would return soon. As they drove away, she looked back at the small ranch house, feeling a strange mixture of loss and determination. This land had cost her brother his life. She needed to understand why. Back in town, Abigail's first stop was the church. The white clapboard building stood at the edge of town, a beacon of stability in the chaotic west. The door was unlocked, and she slipped inside, finding the sanctuary empty except for a man at the altar, arranging hymnals. "Reverend Hayes," she called softly. The man turned, his kind face lighting with recognition. "You must be Abigail Norwood. I've been expecting you." He crossed the church, extending a hand in welcome. "I'm Reverend Samuel Hayes. Your brother was a faithful attendee of our congregation." Abigail shook his hand, finding comfort in his gentle demeanor. "Reverend, I found my brother's journal. It mentioned that he left something in your care." The Reverend's expression grew serious. "Yes, he did. Thomas came to me the Sunday before his death, very troubled. He left a sealed envelope and made me promise to give it only to you, should anything happen to him." He led her to his small office off the main sanctuary, unlocked a drawer in his desk, and withdrew an envelope bearing her name in Thomas's familiar handwriting. "Whatever is in there caused your brother great concern. I believe it may also be what led to his death." With trembling fingers, Abigail opened the envelope. Inside were several documents, land surveys, letters, and a map of the region with certain properties marked in red, including her brother's ranch. One document stood out, a letter on expensive stationery bearing the letterhead Valentine Blackburn Enterprises. The letter detailed plans for purchasing properties along a specific route, offering inflated prices to landowners, but also containing veiled threats for those who refused to sell. Attached was a second document, a survey indicating that a significant coal deposit lay beneath several properties, including Thomas's ranch. The railroad was just a pretense. The real value was in the coal. "Valentine Blackburn," Abigail whispered, the initials from Thomas's journal now making sense. "Who is he?" "A businessman from Denver," Reverend Hayes replied. "He arrived in these parts about a year ago, buying up land, making grand promises about bringing prosperity to the region through the railroad. Many folks sold to him, eager for the money. Your brother was among the few holdouts." Abigail stared at the documents, realization dawning. "He was killed because of this." "That would be my guess," the Reverend said softly. "Though proving it would be another matter entirely. Blackburn is powerful, with friends in high places." As Abigail left the church, the weight of this knowledge heavy on her shoulders, the sun was setting over the distant mountains. She was so preoccupied that she didn't notice the man watching her from the shadows across the street, a well-dressed figure with cold eyes who observed her tucking the envelope into her handbag before slipping away toward the Silver Dollar Saloon. That night, Abigail could barely sleep, her mind racing with all she had learned. By morning, she had made a decision: she would not sell her brother's land, no matter what pressure came her way. She owed Thomas that much. After breakfast, she made her way to the sheriff's office to share what she had discovered, only to find it empty. A note on the door explaining that Sheriff Miller had been called to a disturbance at an outlying ranch. As she turned to leave, a deep voice called her name. "Miss Norwood." Ethan Thornton stood at the corner of the building, his expression grave. "I've been looking for you. We need to talk, but not here." Too many eyes and ears in this town. Despite her natural caution, something in his manner, a quiet intensity, an unspoken urgency, compelled her to trust him. She followed him to the livery stable where 2 horses were already saddled. "I hope you can ride," he said, helping her mount a gentle-looking mare. "My father insisted I learn," she replied, gathering the reins. "Where are we going?" "Somewhere we can speak freely." He swung onto his own mount, a muscular bay gelding. "Follow me and stay close." They rode out of town, following a trail that wound along the creek and eventually led to a stand of cottonwoods. Ethan dismounted and helped Abigail down, tying the horses where they could drink from the clear water. "Your brother and I served together in the war," he explained, leading her to a fallen log where they could sit. "When he wrote that he'd settled out here, I came to visit and ended up staying." We were partners of sorts. I helped with the ranch while running some cattle of my own on adjacent land. Why didn't you tell me this yesterday? Abigail asked. Because I needed to be sure you weren't working with Blackburn. His blue eyes were intense as they studied her. Thomas trusted me with his suspicions about the coal deposits. After he was killed, I've been watching, waiting, trying to gather evidence against Blackburn. I found documents, Abigail admitted. Letters, surveys, maps, all in a package Thomas left with Reverend Hayes. Ethan's expression tightened. Those could be enough to bring Blackburn down, but only if we can get them to the federal marshal in Denver. Blackburn has the local law in his pocket, not Miller, but the circuit judge and the territorial officials. A twig snapped nearby, and Ethan was immediately on his feet, his hand moving to the revolver at his hip. We need to move. I don't think we were followed, but I can't be certain. As they mounted up, Abigail realized she had made a critical error. The documents, I left them at the hotel. Ethan's face paled. We need to get back. Now. They rode hard for town, arriving to find a commotion outside the hotel. Mrs. Finch stood on the porch, wringing her hands, while Sheriff Miller questioned several onlookers. What happened? Ethan demanded as they approached. Break-in at the hotel, Miller replied. Miss Norwood's room was ransacked. Abigail dismounted hastily and rushed inside, taking the stairs 2 at a time. Her room was in disarray, drawers pulled out, the mattress upended, her clothing scattered. The handbag containing Thomas's documents was gone. Sheriff Miller appeared in the doorway behind her. What were they looking for, Miss Norwood? Before she could answer, Ethan stepped forward. Evidence, Sheriff. Evidence that Valentine Blackburn has been forcing people off their land to get at the coal underneath. Miller's expression darkened. That's a serious accusation, Thornton. It's the truth, Abigail insisted. My brother had proof, surveys, letters, threats from Blackburn himself. That's why he was killed. The sheriff rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. I've had my suspicions about Thomas's death, but Blackburn's a powerful man, without solid evidence. We need to find who took those documents, Ethan said. They couldn't have gotten far. A search of the town yielded nothing, and as evening fell, Abigail found herself sitting dejectedly on the hotel porch, watching as the townspeople made their way to the church for the Wednesday evening service. You should come, Mrs. Finch suggested, pausing on her way out. Prayer has a way of clearing the mind when troubles mount. Abigail hadn't attended church regularly since leaving Boston, but something about the simple white building with its welcoming doors drew her. Perhaps there she might find some peace, some guidance on what to do next. The church was nearly full when she arrived, townsfolk in their best clothes filling the pews. Reverend Hayes stood at the pulpit, his voice rising and falling as he spoke of faith in difficult times. Abigail slipped into a back pew, feeling both out of place and strangely at home. Halfway through the service, the church door opened, and Abigail turned with the rest of the congregation to see Ethan Thornton standing in the doorway. His eyes scanned the room, settling on her, and without hesitation, he walked down the aisle and slid into the pew beside her. A murmur ran through the congregation. Mrs. Wilson, seated across the aisle, leaned toward her neighbor, whispering loud enough for Abigail to hear. Well, I never. Thornton hasn't set foot in church since Thomas Norwood's funeral. Ethan seemed oblivious to the stares, his attention focused on Reverend Hayes, who had paused momentarily before continuing his sermon. But Abigail was acutely aware of his presence beside her, solid, reassuring, somehow right. When the service ended, Reverend Hayes invited the congregation to share refreshments in the churchyard. As people filed out, Ethan remained seated, waiting until the church was nearly empty before speaking. I found out who took your documents, he said quietly. One of Blackburn's men, a fellow named Jenkins. He's staying at the saloon. Can we confront him? Abigail asked. Not directly. He'd deny it, and we'd have no way to prove it. Ethan's expression was grim. But I have a plan. Before he could elaborate, Reverend Hayes approached them, his face alight with a warm smile. Miss Norwood, Mr. Thornton, I'm glad to see you both here tonight. Reverend, Ethan acknowledged with a nod. Forgive me for not being a more regular attendee. The Lord welcomes all, whenever they choose to come, Hayes replied diplomatically. Then, lowering his voice, I heard about the break-in, Miss Norwood. The documents Thomas left with me, they were taken? Yes, Abigail confirmed. But Mr. Thornton believes he knows who has them. Hayes glanced around the nearly empty church. Come to my office. We can speak more freely there. In the Reverend's small office, Ethan outlined what he had learned. Jenkins, one of Blackburn's hired guns, had been seen leaving the hotel around the time of the break-in. He was currently staying at the saloon, likely waiting for instructions on delivering the documents to Blackburn, who was expected to arrive in town the following day. If we can recover those documents before Blackburn gets them, we might still have a chance, Ethan concluded. But getting into Jenkins' room won't be easy. Perhaps we don't need to, Reverend Hayes suggested thoughtfully. Thomas made copies of everything he gave me. I have them hidden in the church. Abigail stared at him in disbelief. Copies? Why didn't you mention this before? Thomas asked me not to reveal their existence unless absolutely necessary. He was concerned about my safety as well as yours. The Reverend moved to a painting of Christ that hung behind his desk, swinging it aside to reveal a small wall safe. The originals may be gone, but Blackburn doesn't know about these. The copied documents were identical to those Abigail had seen: the surveys, the letters, the maps, everything they needed to prove Blackburn's schemes. This changes things, Ethan said, studying the papers. We don't need to recover what was stolen. We need to get these to the federal marshal in Denver before Blackburn realizes we have them. The stage doesn't leave until Friday, Abigail pointed out. And Blackburn arrives tomorrow, Ethan added. We need another way. Reverend Hayes cleared his throat. I may have a solution. My brother-in-law is a conductor on the Denver and Rio Grande. There's a freight train passing through the Carson Junction station tomorrow night. It's 30 miles east, but with good horses, you could make it. Ethan considered this. It would mean leaving immediately, riding through the night. I'm coming with you, Abigail declared firmly. Both men looked at her in surprise. Miss Norwood, Ethan began. The journey would be dangerous. This is my brother's legacy, she interrupted. These are his discoveries, his work. I won't stay behind while others risk themselves for his cause. Ethan studied her for a long moment, and Abigail held his gaze, unwavering. Finally, he nodded. Very well, but we'll need to move quickly and quietly. If Blackburn's men realize we have copies. They made hasty preparations. Reverend Hayes provided them with a letter for his brother-in-law, while Ethan gathered supplies and fresh horses. Abigail returned to the hotel just long enough to pack a small bag with essentials, avoiding Mrs. Finch's curious questions about her hurried departure. As midnight approached, they met behind the church, where 2 horses waited, saddlebags already packed with provisions. The moon's bright tonight, Ethan observed, helping Abigail mount. That's both a blessing and a curse, good for seeing our way, but makes us more visible too. They rode east, following game trails and cattle paths rather than the main road, Ethan setting a pace that was sustainable for the long journey ahead. The night was cool, the sky ablaze with stars, and despite the danger of their situation, Abigail found herself oddly exhilarated. You ride well, Ethan commented after several miles of silence. My father was a cavalry officer, Abigail explained. He taught both Thomas and me from an early age. Thomas spoke of him often, said he was a man of principle. He was. He died at Gettysburg. Ethan nodded, understanding in his eyes. I was there. Different regiment, but same hellish day. They lapsed into silence again, the rhythmic sound of hoofbeats and the occasional cry of a night bird the only interruption to their thoughts. After several hours, they stopped at a small creek to rest the horses and drink from their canteens. We should reach Carson Junction by late afternoon if we maintain this pace, Ethan said, studying the eastern horizon where the faintest hint of dawn was beginning to lighten the sky. Abigail stretched her aching muscles, determined not to show any weakness. Tell me about your land, she said, partly from genuine interest and partly to distract herself from her discomfort. It's not much, 100 acres adjoining your brother's property to the north. Enough for the small herd I'm building. Ethan's expression softened as he spoke of his ranch. There's a view from the highest point that makes you believe in God, even on your worst days. You should have told me we were neighbors when we first met, Abigail chided gently. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Would it have made a difference? Perhaps. I might have trusted you sooner. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, a possibility. Then Ethan cleared his throat and checked his pocket watch. We should move on. We've got a long way to go. They continued east as the sun rose, warming their backs. By mid-morning, they had left the familiar territory around Redemption Valley and entered a landscape of rolling hills and scattered pinyon pines. They stopped briefly at a small homestead where an old couple provided them with fresh water and hot coffee, asking no questions when Ethan offered payment. It was late afternoon when they crested a hill and saw Carson Junction in the distance, little more than a water tower, a few buildings, and the railroad tracks stretching like silver ribbons toward the horizon. We made good time, Ethan observed. The freight train won't arrive until after sunset. They approached the station cautiously, alert for any sign of Blackburn's men. The town was quiet, just a handful of residents going about their business. The station itself was manned by a single agent who barely looked up from his newspaper when they entered. Ethan presented Reverend Hayes's letter to the agent, who studied it briefly before nodding. Milton's train is due at 8. You can wait in the back room if you don't want to be seen. The back room was small and dusty, furnished with only a wooden bench and a pot-bellied stove that wasn't lit. Through a grimy window, they could see the tracks and the empty platform. Now we wait, Ethan said, checking his revolver before sitting on the bench. Abigail sat beside him, the documents secure in the inner pocket of her jacket. Do you think we were followed? I've been watching. I don't think so, but Blackburn has eyes everywhere. He glanced at her. Are you afraid? Yes, she admitted, but also determined. Thomas deserves justice. Ethan's hand covered hers, warm and calloused. He would be proud of you, Abigail. It was the first time he had used her given name, and it sent an unexpected thrill through her. As he would be of you, standing by his cause even after his death. The hours passed slowly. As darkness fell, Ethan lit a small lantern provided by the station agent. Its warm glow cast long shadows on the walls and illuminated Abigail's features in a way that made Ethan's breath catch. She was beautiful not in the fragile, ornamental way of city women, but with a strength and determination that shone from within. Tell me about Boston, he said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. Abigail smiled, memories of home both sweet and bitter. It's nothing like this. The streets are crowded, the buildings tall and close together. There's always noise, carriages, vendors, church bells. After my father died and Thomas went west, I taught at a girls' school to support myself. Do you miss it? She considered this. I missed the certainty of it, knowing where I belonged, what each day would bring. But there was a sameness that grew stifling. She looked up at him. What about you? Where were you before the war? Pennsylvania. My father had a small farm. After he died, it went to my older brother. I was always the restless one, so I joined the army. Ethan's eyes grew distant. After Gettysburg, I couldn't go back. Too many ghosts. And now? Will you stay in Redemption Valley? I've put down roots there deeper than I expected to. His gaze held hers, more so now than ever. The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities. Then a distant whistle broke the silence, the freight train approaching. They gathered their things quickly, extinguishing the lantern before slipping onto the platform. The train rounded the bend, its powerful engine belching smoke and steam as it slowed for the water tower. A man leaned out from the cab, waving when he spotted them. That's Milton, Ethan said, guiding Abigail toward the slowing train. Reverend Hayes's brother-in-law. Milton Hayes was a burly man with a thick mustache and friendly eyes that crinkled at the corners. You must be the folks Samuel mentioned, he said, helping them climb aboard. Got his letter about getting you to Denver. Important business, he said. Very important, Ethan confirmed. And potentially dangerous. We're grateful for your help. The engineer's compartment was cramped and hot, the roar of the engine making conversation difficult. Milton explained that they would reach Denver by morning, and that he could arrange for them to be met at the station by a friend who worked for the marshal's office. As the train gathered speed, Abigail watched the landscape disappear into darkness, her mind racing with all that had happened since she'd arrived in Redemption Valley. Her life had changed irrevocably in just a few days, yet she felt more alive, more purposeful than she had in years. Beside her, Ethan maintained a vigilant watch out the window, one hand resting near his revolver. His profile, strong and determined in the dim light from the engine's fire, gave her a sense of security she hadn't expected to find so far from home. The night passed in a blur of motion and noise. Abigail dozed occasionally, her head nodding against Ethan's shoulder. Each time she awoke, she found him still alert, still watching over her. By the time the eastern sky began to lighten, revealing the outline of the Rocky Mountains against the horizon, Denver's outskirts came into view. "We're almost there," Milton announced over the roar of the engine. "My friend will be waiting at the freight yard man named Peterson. He'll get you to the marshal." The train slowed as it approached the city, the countryside giving way to scattered buildings, and then to the more densely packed structures of Denver itself. When they finally pulled into the freight yard, the sun was fully risen, illuminating a busy scene of workers loading and unloading cargo. Milton pointed out a tall man in a worn leather coat waiting near the yard office. "That's Peterson. Good man. Served with the marshal during the war." They thanked Milton for his help, promising to let Reverend Hayes know they'd arrived safely, then made their way across the yard to Peterson. "You must be Thornton and Miss Norwood," Peterson said without preamble. "Got a wagon waiting. Marshal Jenkins is expecting you." The federal marshal's office was in a brick building near the center of Denver, its interior a stark contrast to the rustic sheriff's office in Redemption Valley. Marshal Jenkins was a lean, hard-looking man with intelligent eyes who listened carefully as Ethan and Abigail presented their evidence against Valentine Blackburn. "These are serious accusations," Jenkins said, examining the documents spread across his desk. "Blackburn has powerful friends, including a territorial judge and at least one senator back east. My brother was murdered because of what he discovered," Abigail said firmly. "Others may have been as well. How many deaths will it take before someone stands up to him?" The marshal studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "I've had suspicions about Blackburn's operations for some time, but never enough evidence to move against him. This," he tapped the documents, "might be enough, especially with your testimony." "What happens now?" Ethan asked. "I'll need to wire the U.S. attorney in Washington. In the meantime, you two should stay in Denver where I can ensure your safety." Jenkins stood. "I know a boarding house where you'll be comfortable and inconspicuous." The Peterson house was a modest establishment run by the marshal's sister-in-law, who showed them to separate rooms on the second floor with a promise of hot water for bathing and a substantial meal to follow. Alone in her room, Abigail finally allowed herself to feel the exhaustion of their journey. Her muscles ached from the long ride, and her mind was overwhelmed with all that had transpired. She sank onto the bed, intending to rest for just a moment before bathing, and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. She awoke to a gentle knock at her door and the realization that the light had changed. It was late afternoon. Ethan's voice came through the door. "Abigail? Mrs. Peterson has supper ready if you're feeling up to it." "Just a moment," she called, hastily smoothing her wrinkled dress and attempting to tame her hair. Downstairs, Mrs. Peterson had prepared a hearty meal of roast beef, potatoes, and fresh bread. Ethan was already seated at the table, his hair damp from bathing, wearing a clean shirt that Mrs. Peterson had found among her late husband's things. "I was beginning to think you might sleep through until tomorrow," he teased gently as Abigail took her seat. "I hadn't realized how tired I was," she admitted. "Have you heard anything from Marshal Jenkins?" "He sent word that he's meeting with the territorial governor this evening. The wheels of justice are turning, albeit slowly." Mrs. Peterson bustled around them, refilling coffee cups and offering second helpings. "The marshal said you two have had quite an adventure. Something about exposing a land-grabbing scheme." "Something like that," Ethan replied vaguely, clearly not wanting to share details. After supper, they sat on the boarding house's front porch, watching as Denver settled into evening. The city was so different from Redemption Valley, busier, more cosmopolitan, yet somehow less immediate. Abigail found herself missing the wide open spaces and the clarity of purpose she'd found there. "What will you do when this is over?" Ethan asked, breaking the comfortable silence between them. Abigail considered the question. "I haven't thought that far ahead. I suppose I'll return to my brother's ranch, my ranch now, and decide whether to stay or sell." "And if you stay?" Ethan's voice was carefully neutral, but his eyes, when she met them, were anything but. "I know nothing about ranching," she admitted. "I would need help. I happen to be an excellent rancher, he said, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Are you offering your services, Mr. Thornton? Abigail asked, her heart beating faster despite her attempt at a light tone. I'm offering more than that, Miss Norwood. He turned to face her fully. I'm offering partnership, in whatever form you might consider it. The implication hung in the air between them, full of possibility. Before Abigail could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted the moment. Marshal Jenkins strode up the path, his expression grave. We have a problem, he announced without preamble. Blackburn knows you're in Denver. One of my deputies spotted his men watching this house not an hour ago. Ethan was on his feet immediately. How did he find us so quickly? That's what concerns me, Jenkins replied. Someone must have tipped him off. We need to move you somewhere safer while we proceed with the investigation. They were relocated to a small hotel on the outskirts of the city, with 2 deputies stationed in the lobby. For 3 days, they waited, confined to the hotel except for brief, escorted outings. Marshal Jenkins visited daily, bringing updates on the investigation's progress. On the 4th day, he arrived with news. The U.S. Attorney has reviewed the evidence and authorized us to arrest Blackburn on charges of fraud, intimidation, and conspiracy related to the land acquisitions. We're also investigating his connection to your brother's murder, Miss Norwood. You've arrested him, then? Abigail asked eagerly. Jenkins's expression darkened. That's the problem. Blackburn seems to have gotten wind of our plans. He left Denver early this morning, presumably headed back to Redemption Valley. We need to warn Sheriff Miller, Ethan said urgently. Blackburn might try to destroy any remaining evidence or silence potential witnesses. I've already wired Miller, Jenkins assured him, and I'm sending a team of deputies to Redemption Valley tomorrow. But I'm concerned about your safety if you return now. We can't stay here while others may be in danger because of us, Abigail insisted. Reverend Hayes, Mrs. Finch, they all helped us. They could be targets. Ethan nodded in agreement. Abigail's right. We need to go back. Marshal Jenkins studied them both, recognizing their determination. Very well, but you'll travel with my deputies, and you'll follow their instructions to the letter. Blackburn is desperate now, which makes him more dangerous than ever. They left Denver at dawn the following day, traveling in a small convoy, 2 wagons and 4 riders, including Ethan and Abigail on fresh horses provided by the marshal. The journey back to Redemption Valley would take 2 days, even pushing the pace. As they rode, Abigail found herself watching the landscape with new eyes. What had seemed alien and harsh when she first arrived now held a strange beauty: the sweep of grassland, the distant mountains, the endless sky. Or perhaps it was the man riding beside her who had changed her perception. They made camp that night beside a small creek, the deputies taking turns standing watch. Ethan and Abigail sat by the fire, speaking in low voices. Are you afraid? He asked, echoing his question from days earlier. Less than I should be, she admitted. Somehow, facing Blackburn feels right necessary. For Thomas, and for myself. Ethan's hand found hers in the firelight. Whatever happens in Redemption Valley, you won't face it alone. The simple promise meant more than any flowery declaration could have. Abigail squeezed his hand, words unnecessary between them. They reached the outskirts of Redemption Valley late the following afternoon. From a hill overlooking the town, they could see unusual activity. A number of horses and wagons gathered outside the Silver Dollar Saloon, which Ethan identified as belonging to Blackburn and his men. Looks like they've taken over the saloon, observed the lead deputy, a serious man named Cooper. We should approach carefully. They skirted around the town, approaching from the north to avoid being spotted. The church stood a short distance from the main street, and they stopped there first, hoping to find Reverend Hayes. The church was empty, but as they searched for the Reverend, the door opened and Sheriff Miller entered, his expression changing from surprise to relief at the sight of them. Thank God you're back, he said. Blackburn and his men rode in yesterday, making all kinds of accusations about you 2 stealing private business documents. He's demanding I arrest you on sight. We have federal marshals with us, Ethan explained, indicating the deputies. And evidence of Blackburn's crimes that's been verified by the U.S. Attorney. Miller's shoulders sagged in relief. That's good to hear. I've been stalling him, but he's growing impatient. He's gathered all his men at the saloon, at least a dozen of them, all armed. Deputy Cooper stepped forward. We have warrants for Blackburn's arrest. We'll need your support, Sheriff. You'll have it, Miller assured him. But we need to be careful about how we approach this. A frontal assault on the saloon could lead to innocent people getting hurt. They were discussing strategy when the church door opened again, and Reverend Hayes entered, his face lighting with surprise and joy at the sight of Abigail and Ethan. You're back. We've been praying for your safe return. He crossed to them quickly. Blackburn has been making terrible accusations claiming you stole from him, that you're both wanted criminals. We have the federal marshals with us, Abigail explained. They're going to arrest Blackburn. The Reverend's expression grew solemn. He's a dangerous man, especially now that he's cornered. The entire town is on edge. As they continued their discussion, formulating a plan to apprehend Blackburn with minimal risk to the townspeople, the church door burst open once more. Mrs. Finch stood in the doorway, her face pale with fear. They're coming, she gasped. Blackburn and his men, they know you're here. Through the church windows, they could see a group of armed men approaching on horseback. Valentine Blackburn in the lead, a distinguished-looking man with silver hair and cold eyes. The deputies moved quickly, positioning themselves at the doors and windows. Stay back, Cooper instructed Abigail and Reverend Hayes. Sheriff, we need to try to defuse this situation. Miller nodded grimly, checking his revolver before stepping toward the door. Let me talk to him first. He might listen to local authority. Be careful, Ethan warned. He's desperate now. Sheriff Miller stepped out onto the church steps, his badge clearly visible in the late afternoon sun. That's far enough, Blackburn, he called. There are federal marshals here with warrants for your arrest. I suggest you surrender peacefully. Blackburn reined in his horse, his men fanning out behind him. This is a local matter, Sheriff. Those two are thieves who stole private business documents. I demand their immediate arrest. The U.S. Attorney disagrees with your version of events, Miller replied steadily. The documents show you've been engaging in fraud and intimidation to acquire land for its coal deposits. There's also the matter of Thomas Norwood's murder. Blackburn's face hardened. Preposterous accusations. I'm a businessman, not a killer. A businessman who doesn't mind getting blood on his hands when profits are at stake, Ethan said, stepping out to stand beside Sheriff Miller. We have evidence linking your man Jenkins to Thomas Norwood's murder, acting on your orders. For a moment, tension crackled in the air like lightning before a storm. Then Blackburn's composure broke. Take them, he shouted to his men. Burn the church if you have to. What followed was chaos. The deputies emerged from the church, weapons drawn, identifying themselves as federal officers. Several of Blackburn's men, seeing they were outmatched in authority if not in numbers, threw down their weapons. Others opened fire, bullets splintering the church's wooden steps. Ethan pushed Sheriff Miller back toward the doorway, drawing his own weapon. Inside, Abigail and Reverend Hayes had taken cover behind the sturdy wooden pews. The gunfire outside was deafening, punctuated by shouted commands from Deputy Cooper. Then, suddenly, there was a moment of silence, followed by a single shot. Abigail peered over the pew to see Ethan clutching his arm, blood seeping between his fingers. Blackburn himself stood a few yards away, his smoking revolver trained on Ethan's chest for a killing shot. Without thinking, Abigail grabbed Sheriff Miller's shotgun, which he had left propped against the pew, and rushed to the doorway. Stop, she shouted. Blackburn turned toward her, surprise flashing across his face at the sight of a woman holding a shotgun. That moment of hesitation was all the deputies needed. Two of them tackled Blackburn from behind, disarming him and forcing him to the ground. The fight went out of Blackburn's remaining men at the sight of their leader subdued. Within minutes, the marshals had the situation under control, with Blackburn and his men disarmed and under arrest. Abigail dropped the shotgun and rushed to Ethan's side. How badly are you hurt? Just a graze, he assured her, though his face was pale with pain. You saved my life, Abigail Norwood. We saved each other, she replied softly. The aftermath of the confrontation transformed Redemption Valley. Blackburn and his men were taken to Denver to face federal charges. The investigation revealed that Thomas Norwood had indeed been murdered on Blackburn's orders after refusing to sell his land and threatening to expose the coal scheme. As news of Blackburn's arrest spread, other landowners came forward with their own stories of intimidation and fraud, strengthening the case against him. The federal government took control of the contested lands until the legal issues could be resolved, ensuring the coal deposits would be properly regulated if mining was to proceed. For Abigail, the weeks following Blackburn's arrest were a time of decisions. She moved into her brother's ranch house, learning the operations of the property with Ethan's guidance. His own ranch adjoining hers created a natural partnership, their combined lands forming one of the more substantial properties in the area. It was a Sunday morning, nearly 2 months after their return from Denver, when Ethan appeared at her door wearing his best shirt and a somewhat nervous expression. "I thought we might attend church together today," he suggested. "If you're agreeable." Abigail smiled, noting his unusually formal manner. "I'd like that very much." The church was full when they arrived, the pews filled with familiar faces. Mrs. Finch beamed at them from her usual spot near the front, while Sheriff Miller nodded in greeting from the back row. Reverend Hayes stood at the pulpit, his kind eyes crinkling with a knowing smile as Ethan led Abigail to a pew midway down the aisle. As they sat side by side, Abigail was acutely aware of the whispers and glances from the congregation. Ethan Thornton, the solitary rancher who rarely attended church, sitting beside Miss Norwood in full view of everyone, it was as clear a declaration as if he'd shouted it from the rooftops. The service proceeded as usual, with hymns and prayers and Reverend Hayes's thoughtful sermon about finding blessings in unexpected places. Throughout, Ethan remained close beside Abigail, their shoulders occasionally touching, his presence solid and reassuring. When the final hymn ended and the congregation began to disperse, Ethan made no move to leave. Instead, he turned to face Abigail, taking both her hands in his. "I'm not a man of many words," he began, his voice low but steady. "But I want to say this in front of God and these people. When I stood beside you in this church that first Wednesday night, I knew something had changed for me. I knew I belonged by your side, and you by mine." Abigail's heart raced, her eyes fixed on his earnest face. Around them, the congregation had grown quiet, aware that something significant was happening. "Abigail Norwood," Ethan continued, "I love you. I think I began to love you the moment you stood up to Sheriff Miller, demanding justice for your brother. I know it's been only a few months, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Will you marry me?" The church was utterly silent now, everyone waiting for her answer. Abigail looked into Ethan's blue eyes, seeing in them the future she hadn't known she wanted until she came to Redemption Valley. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and confident. "Yes, I will marry you, Ethan Thornton." A cheer went up from the congregation, led by Mrs. Finch's enthusiastic applause. Reverend Hayes stepped down from the pulpit, beaming with approval. "Shall we make it official right now?" he suggested. "Since we're all here anyway." Ethan looked to Abigail, leaving the decision to her. She hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Yes, today is perfect." What followed was a hastily arranged but joyful ceremony. Mrs. Finch provided flowers from her garden for Abigail to carry, while Sheriff Miller stood as witness for them both. The entire town stayed to see Ethan Thornton and Abigail Norwood become husband and wife, their union blessed in the same church where they had first acknowledged their feelings for each other. As Reverend Hayes pronounced them married, Ethan drew Abigail into a tender kiss, his arms strong around her. The applause of the congregation faded to background noise as they shared this first moment as husband and wife. "I never expected to find love in Redemption Valley," Abigail whispered when they finally parted. Ethan smiled, touching her cheek gently. "Sometimes redemption comes in forms we don't anticipate." They walked out of the church hand in hand, into the bright sunshine of a new day and a new life together. The mountains stood majestic in the distance, and the land that had been Thomas's legacy stretched before them, full of promise. That night, in the ranch house that was now their home, Ethan and Abigail sat on the porch, watching as stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky. The events that had brought them together, Thomas's death, Blackburn's schemes, their dangerous journey to Denver, seemed almost like a distant dream now. "Do you think your brother would approve?" Ethan asked, his arm around her shoulders. Abigail leaned into his embrace, content in a way she had never imagined possible. "I think he orchestrated the whole thing," she said with a soft laugh. "Leaving me the ranch next to yours, making sure we would meet. Then I owe him more than I can ever repay." Ethan said, pressing a kiss to her temple. As autumn gave way to winter and winter to spring, their life together found its rhythm. Abigail learned the ways of ranching, discovering a natural affinity for the work that surprised both her and Ethan. Together, they expanded their operations, adding cattle and improving the pastures. The house that had once felt foreign to Abigail became truly her home, filled with small touches that reflected their shared life. News came from Denver that Valentine Blackburn had been convicted on multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy. Though there wasn't enough evidence to convict him directly of Thomas's murder, his role in ordering it was widely acknowledged. He would spend many years in prison, his empire of corruption dismantled. By the following summer, Abigail and Ethan's ranch had become one of the most prosperous in the area. The railroad did eventually come through Redemption Valley, though along a different route than Blackburn had planned, bringing new opportunities for the town and its residents. It was on a Sunday morning much like the one when Ethan had proposed that Abigail shared her own news with him. They were preparing for church, Ethan adjusting his tie in the mirror while Abigail pinned up her hair. "I think we may need to build that additional bedroom sooner than we planned," she said casually, watching his reflection for his reaction. Ethan turned slowly, his eyes wide with understanding. "Abigail, are you saying?" She nodded, unable to contain her smile. "Dr. Reynolds confirmed it yesterday. We're going to have a baby, Ethan." In 3 strides, he had crossed the room and swept her into his arms, his face alight with joy. "A baby," he repeated, as if testing the reality of the word. "Our baby. Due in winter," Abigail added. "Dr. Reynolds says I'm in excellent health, so there's no cause for worry." Ethan pressed his forehead to hers, his voice thick with emotion. "I never thought I could be this happy. You've given me everything, Abigail." That day, when they entered the church, Ethan stood beside her with unmistakable pride, his hand protective at the small of her back. The congregation, now used to seeing them together, nonetheless noticed something different about them, a special glow, a secret joy. Reverend Hayes, who had become a close friend, caught Abigail's eye during the service and smiled knowingly. Later, when he shook their hands at the door, he whispered, "God's blessings come in all forms. Yours will be especially precious, I think." As they walked home across the fields that connected the church to their ranch, Ethan took Abigail's hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "I was thinking we might name the baby Thomas if it's a boy," he suggested, "to honor your brother." Tears welled in Abigail's eyes at the thoughtfulness of this gesture. "He would like that. And if it's a girl?" "Elizabeth, after my mother," Ethan replied, "though we have months yet to decide." The baby, a boy they did indeed name Thomas, was born on a cold winter night with Dr. Reynolds in attendance and Mrs. Finch serving as midwife. Ethan paced the hallway outside their bedroom until the first cries of his son brought him rushing in, his face a mixture of worry and wonder. "You have a son," Abigail told him, exhausted but radiant as she cradled the tiny bundle. "Come meet him." Ethan approached the bed cautiously, as if afraid his rough hands might somehow harm this miraculous new being. When Abigail placed their son in his arms, his expression of awe was something she knew she would remember all her days. "Hello, Thomas," he whispered to the infant. "I'm your father." The baby yawned, his tiny fingers curling around Ethan's much larger one, and in that moment, their family was complete. As the years passed, Redemption Valley continued to grow and prosper. The Thornton Ranch expanded, becoming known for its fine cattle and horses. Thomas grew into a strong, curious boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determination. When he was 3, a sister joined the family, Elizabeth, called Eliza, with a mop of chestnut curls and a smile that could charm the birds from the trees. Each Sunday, without fail, Ethan Thornton stood beside his wife in church, their children between them, a living testament to the unexpected journey that had brought them together. And each time, Abigail would glance at him during the service, remembering that first Wednesday night when a solitary cowboy had walked down the aisle to sit beside her, making a statement to the entire town. "What are you thinking about?" Ethan would sometimes ask, catching her contemplative gaze. And Abigail would smile, squeezing his hand. "About how you stood beside me in church that night, proving to everyone that I belonged to you." "And you to me," he would always reply. "Always and forever." In Redemption Valley, Their story became something of a legend: the Eastern woman who came seeking justice for her murdered brother, the stoic rancher who helped her find it, and the love that blossomed between them against all odds. But for Ethan and Abigail Thornton, it wasn't legend, it was simply their life, built day by day in the wild land that had become their home. And on quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the ranch work was done, they would sit together on their porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains, grateful for the twist of fate that had brought them together in this remote corner of the West. For in finding each other, they had both found something they hadn't known. They were seeking not just love, but belonging, purpose, and the deep contentment that comes from building a life with the right person by your side.